Respect isn't something you can buy with money, but arrogance is something that can cost you everything, as my mother-in-law was about to learn the hard way. The November wind carried a crisp chill through the streets of the quiet, working-class neighborhood where Otis and Ruth lived. It was Thanksgiving afternoon, the kind of day that usually smelled of roasted turkey and burning firewood, but for Nia, the air felt heavy with anxiety. She stood by the open door of her husband Liam's sedan, watching her parents walk down the path of the modest brick house they had called home for 40 years. Otis adjusted his flat cap, smoothing down the lapels of his navy blazer. It was an old jacket bought years ago, but he wore it with the kind of dignity that made it look tailored. Beside him, Ruth moved with a gentle grace, clutching a foil-covered dish against her chest as if it were a precious gem. Inside was her famous sweet potato pie, still warm from the oven. Its scent sweet enough to calm anyone except, perhaps, the woman they were about to meet. Nia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She reached out to straighten her father's collar, her fingers lingering for a moment. "Dad, are you sure about this?" she whispered, glancing at Liam, who was nervously tapping the steering wheel. "Catherine, she can be difficult. She cares a lot about appearances." Otis smiled, the crinkles around his eyes deepening. He placed a calloused hand over hers. "Nia, baby," he said, his voice a deep, steady rumble that always made the world feel safer. "We aren't going there to impress her. We are going there to break bread. A man's worth isn't in the cut of his suit, but in the way he treats his neighbor. Don't you worry about us." Nia forced a smile, though her heart pounded. If only Catherine knew. If only her mother-in-law could see past the older model car and the simple Sunday-best clothes. She didn't know that the couple walking toward the car weren't just retired factory workers. She had no idea that Otis and Ruth had quietly built a logistics empire, sold it for a fortune, and reinvested it into a massive portfolio called Apex Holdings. They could have bought Catherine's entire gated community without blinking, but they chose to live simply, believing that true wealth was quiet. The drive to Connecticut was filled with a tense silence, broken only by Liam's occasional apologies. "Mom's just particular," he said, looking in the rearview mirror at Otis and Ruth. "She gets stressed during the holidays. Please don't take anything she says to heart." Ruth just patted his shoulder from the back seat. "Oh, hush now, Liam," she said softly. "We're just happy to be invited. Family is family." As they crossed the state line, the scenery changed. Small, cozy houses gave way to sprawling estates hidden behind high hedges. When they finally pulled up to the iron gates of Catherine's mansion, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The driveway was lined with luxury SUVs and sports cars, gleaming under the porch lights. Liam's sensible sedan looked out of place, like a dinghy docked among yachts. Nia saw her father look out the window. He didn't look intimidated. He looked amused, studying the landscaping with the eye of someone who knew exactly what every brick and shrub cost. They parked at the far end of the driveway. As they stepped out, the cold air bit at their cheeks. Nia took a deep breath, trying to channel her parents' calm. They walked toward the grand entrance, the gravel crunching loudly under their shoes. As we walked up the long driveway, I squeezed my father's hand, praying for peace, but the way the front door slammed open told me we were walking straight into a war. Before we open that door and face the storm inside, I have a quick request. If you believe that true worth comes from character, not clothes, please drop the number 8 in the comments below. It lets me know you're standing here with us. And if you haven't yet, join our royal family by subscribing to Black King and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a moment of truth. Your support is the crown that keeps us going. Now, take a deep breath. Let's see what happens next. My mother-in-law, Catherine, had a smile that could freeze hot tea, and she was aiming it directly at my parents. She stood in the center of the grand foyer, framed by a massive crystal chandelier that seemed to drip light onto the marble floor. She was dressed in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my parents' car, her hair coiffed into a helmet of perfection. When she saw Liam, her face lit up, and she rushed forward to embrace him, kissing both his cheeks. "Liam, darling, you're late. The roast is nearly done." She gave me a polite nod, warm enough for a daughter-in-law she tolerated, but cold enough to remind me I was still a guest. Then she turned to my parents. The smile didn't leave her face, but it changed. It became tight, stretched thin like a rubber band about to snap. Her eyes raked over my father's old blazer and stopped at my mother's floral dress. She didn't extend a hand at first. She just stood there, letting the silence stretch awkwardly. "Mother," Liam said, his voice tight. "You remember Otis and Ruth?" "Of course," Catherine said, finally offering a limp hand to my father, pulling it back almost instantly after he shook it. "Welcome to my home. I trust the drive wasn't too taxing for your vehicle." My father just smiled, removing his cap. "The car runs fine, ma'am. Thank you for having us." My mother stepped forward then, her face beaming with genuine warmth. She held out the foil-wrapped dish she had been guarding so carefully. "We didn't want to come empty-handed, Catherine. I made my sweet potato pie. It's an old family recipe." Catherine looked at the aluminum foil as if it were radioactive. She didn't take it. Instead, she signaled to a passing server. "Oh, how quaint," she said, the word dripping with condescension. "Maria, please take this to the kitchen. Put it in the back fridge. We already have a French patisserie delivering dessert, but perhaps the staff might enjoy it later." I saw my mother's smile falter, just for a second, before she recovered her grace. "That would be fine," Ruth said softly. We moved into the living room for drinks. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. Catherine sat on her velvet armchair like a queen holding court, sipping her wine. She turned her gaze to my father. "So Liam tells me you're retired, Otis. It must be a relief to rest your bones. Did you work in manual labor? Or perhaps service?" The assumption hung in the air, heavy and ugly. She didn't ask what he did. She assumed that because he was a black man of a certain age, he must have worked with his hands for people like her. "I worked hard, yes," Otis replied, his voice even, taking a sip of water. "I managed a team. We moved things from point A to point B." "A mover," Catherine nodded knowingly, interrupting him. "Honest work, I suppose. It's rare to see people take pride in simple tasks these days." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that moving things meant owning a global logistics fleet that served half the Fortune 500 companies. But a look from my father stopped me. He was calm, unbothered, observing her like she was a child throwing a tantrum. Catherine wasn't done. She turned to me, her eyes lingering on my braided hair. "Nia, dear, I do wish you'd try that straightening treatment I recommended. It looks a bit untamed for a formal dinner." She glanced at my mother. "But I suppose that's just the style in your community." "It's called heritage, Catherine," Liam said sharply, setting his glass down. "I'm just making conversation, darling." She waved him off, standing up as a bell chimed softly. "Come now. Let's not let the food get cold." Dinner was served, but as we took our seats, Catherine looked at my father's place setting and said the words that would change our lives forever. "There is a silence that is peaceful, and then there is the silence that comes right before an explosion." We were sitting in the latter. The dining room was dimly lit by candlelight, casting flickering shadows against the mahogany walls. The only sound was the clinking of silver against fine china. Catherine sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal like a monarch. She had barely touched her food, preferring instead to regale the table with stories of her social standing. She swirled her wine glass, looking past my parents as if they were invisible. "You know," Catherine began, her voice loud in the quiet room, "this neighborhood is changing. We finally have a management company that understands standards. Apex Holdings bought the entire estate portfolio last month. They are incredibly exclusive. It's a relief, really, to know that people of quality are in charge, keeping the riffraff out." I saw my father exchange a quick, unreadable glance with my mother. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he said nothing. He simply cut his turkey with precise, deliberate movements. Catherine didn't notice. She was too busy scanning my mother's outfit again. "Ruth," she said suddenly, pointing with her fork. "I've been meaning to ask. That dress, is it vintage? Or perhaps from a thrift shop? It has a certain worn quality." My mother set her fork down gently. Her face flushed, but she held her head high. "This is my Sunday church dress, Catherine. I've worn it to every Easter service for 5 years. It holds good memories." Catherine laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like a slap. Oh, how quaint. Sentimental value. I suppose when one cannot afford new things, one must rely on memories. It looks like something my maid would wear to scrub the gutters. The heir left the room. Liam dropped his napkin. Mom, that is enough. But Catherine ignored him. She looked at my parents with open disgust now, the mask of politeness slipping away entirely. I am just being honest, Liam. Why must we pretend? Look at them. They don't fit here. My father stopped eating. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Mrs. Catherine, Otis said, his deep voice filling the room, commanding attention without shouting. You have a beautiful home. But you have forgotten that money can buy a house, but it cannot buy class. And it certainly cannot buy kindness. Catherine's face turned a violent shade of red. Her hands shook. She wasn't used to being spoken to by anyone she deemed beneath her, let alone a black man in an old blazer at her own table. She slammed her hands down on the table, making the silverware jump. How dare you, she hissed, standing up. You come into my house, eat my food, and lecture me? You think you have the right to speak to me like that? She pointed a trembling finger at the door. I will not be insulted by people who don't belong here. Get out. Get out, you dirty poor people. The insult hung in the air, ugly and raw. Tears stung my eyes, but my father stood up slowly. He helped my mother from her chair, his movements tender and protective. He turned to Catherine, his expression unshakable. We are leaving, he said softly. But remember, Catherine, the world is much smaller than you think. He guided us out, his dignity intact, leaving Catherine standing alone in her dining room, breathing hard, surrounded by her expensive things and her cheap spirit. As the heavy front door slammed behind us, leaving us in the cold autumn night, I thought the evening was over. But my father pulled out his phone and made a call that would bring Catherine's world crashing down. That door may have slammed shut, but we all know the real story is just beginning. If you are rooting for Otis and Ruth to get the justice they deserve, please drop the number 8 in the comments below to let me know you're still here with us. And if you haven't joined our community yet, I highly recommend you subscribe to Black King and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the moment the tables turn. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inspire and empower. Now, let's see what happens when that phone call connects. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but my parents didn't believe in revenge. They believed in the truth, and the truth was about to arrive in a tuxedo. 2 weeks had passed since the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. The incident had left a bitter taste in my mouth, but life in high society moved on quickly, lubricated by champagne and gossip. It was the night of the annual Christmas Gala at the Greenwich Country Club, the most exclusive event of the season. The hall was a winter wonderland of white roses, silver ribbons, and a 20-foot spruce tree that smelled of pine and money. Catherine was in her element. She had arrived early, wearing a crimson gown that screamed for attention, determined to repair any cracks in her reputation. I stood by the bar with Liam, watching her work the room. She was holding a flute of sparkling wine, laughing loudly with a group of local socialites. It's such a shame my son's in-laws couldn't make it tonight, I heard her say, her voice carrying over the string quartet. Lovely people really, but simple. A black tie event might have been a bit overwhelming for them. You know how it is when people aren't used to certain settings. Liam gripped his glass so hard his knuckles turned white. I can't believe she's doing this, he muttered. She kicked them out, and now she's painting herself as the benevolent host. Let her talk, I said quietly, checking my watch. Just wait. Catherine continued, oblivious. But the real news is the new ownership of our estate. Apex Holdings. I've heard the chairman is a visionary. I'm hoping to have a private audience with him tonight to discuss some improvements to the clubhouse. It pays to be connected, you know. At that moment, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. The murmuring crowd fell silent as the spotlight hit the stage. The club president stepped up to the microphone, smiling broadly. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice booming. Tonight is a special night. As many of you know, our community has recently been acquired by Apex Holdings. We are honored to have the founder and chairman here with us this evening to make a special donation to our local charity. Please put your hands together for Mr. Otis Thompson and his wife Ruth. The name hung in the air for a split second before the applause started. Catherine froze. Her smile didn't fade. It simply petrified. She blinked, looking around as if she had misheard. The double doors at the back of the room swung open, and there they were. My father walked in, not in an old blazer, but in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. Beside him, my mother was a vision in an emerald silk gown, her hair swept up in an elegant bun, diamonds sparkling at her throat. Real diamonds, not the costume jewelry Catherine had assumed she would wear. They didn't look like the dirty poor people Catherine had screamed at. They looked like royalty. The crowd parted for them. People who had ignored them 2 weeks ago were now craning their necks to get a look. Otis walked with a slow, confident stride, nodding graciously to the applause. As they passed our group, my father didn't stop, but he turned his head slightly. His eyes locked onto Catherine. The crash was small but audible. Catherine's fingers had gone numb. Her crystal champagne flute slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor, splashing wine onto the hem of her crimson dress. She didn't even look down. She was staring at Otis, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. My father stepped onto the stage, shaking hands with the president. He took the microphone, his deep voice commanding the room. "Thank you," he said, and the room went pin-drop silent. "My wife and I believe that a community is built on more than just property values. It is built on how we welcome the stranger in our midst." He looked out at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before landing squarely on the woman standing in a puddle of spilled wine. My mother-in-law's face turned pale as a sheet, and for the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. But the look in my father's eyes said he wasn't done yet. The silence in the room wasn't respect anymore. It was pity, and for a woman like Catherine, pity was worse than death. The rest of the gala blurred into a nightmare for her. The same people who had hung on her every word an hour ago were now suddenly fascinated by the patterns on the carpet whenever she approached. Whispers followed her like a shadow. "Did you hear? She kicked out the chairman." One woman murmured behind a fan. "Called them dirty, can you imagine?" Another replied. Catherine tried to catch the eye of the club president, but he was too busy laughing at a joke Otis had just told. She stood alone in her stained crimson dress, an island of humiliation in a sea of celebration. She wanted to approach Otis, to explain, to lie, to do something, but every time she took a step, a wall of shame, or perhaps the imposing presence of the club's security, held her back. The drive home was suffocating. Liam drove in silence, his jaw set tight. When they finally pulled into the driveway of the mansion that, technically, Otis now controlled, Liam didn't kill the engine. "I'm leaving, Mother," he said, staring straight ahead. Catherine gasped. "Liam, don't be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who they were." "That's the problem." Liam turned to her, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "You treated them like trash not because of what they did, but because of what you thought they were. You saw black skin and humble clothes, and you decided they were beneath you. You didn't just insult my wife's parents, you insulted the very people who hold the deed to this house." I can fix this," Catherine stammered, clutching her purse. "You can't fix this with a phone call or a fruit basket," Liam said, unlocking the doors. "I'm going to stay with Nia. I can't be in a house where pride takes up all the room." He drove away, leaving her standing in the cold driveway, more alone than she had ever been. The next morning broke gray and bleak. Catherine sat at her kitchen table, staring at a courier envelope that had been delivered at dawn. It bore the gold-embossed logo of Apex Holdings. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the letter opener. This was it. The eviction notice. The lawsuit. The demand for immediate repayment of her debts. She had called them dirty poor people, and now they were going to use their billions to crush her. It was exactly what she would have done. She sliced the envelope open, bracing herself for the legal jargon, the dates, the threats. But there were no legal documents inside. No demand for payment. No lawyer's letterhead. Instead, a simple, elegant Christmas card slid out. On the front was a picture of a dove carrying an olive branch. Inside, in neat, strong handwriting, were just 2 sentences. Dear Catherine, may you find the peace this season that status cannot bring. We forgive you. It was signed simply Otis and Ruth. Catherine stared at the card. A lawsuit she could have fought. Anger she could have matched. But this? This grace? It disarmed her completely. She looked around her empty, silent kitchen, realizing that while she had spent her life building walls to keep undesirable people out, she had only succeeded in locking herself in. She expected a lawsuit, revenge, or eviction. But holding that simple card, she realized she was fighting a war against people who had already won by refusing to fight. It takes a strong person to stand up to a bully, but it takes a stronger one to help that bully stand up again. 3 days after receiving the Christmas card, a car pulled up to my parents' modest brick house. It wasn't a limousine or a luxury sedan, but a simple taxi. Catherine stepped out. She looked different. The stiff, armor-like hairspray was gone, replaced by a softer style. She wore a simple wool coat and very little makeup. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time, looking at the house she had once sneered at, clutching her purse like a shield. I opened the door before she could knock. Catherine, may I come in? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I need to say something. I stepped aside. She walked into the living room, which was filled with the smell of cinnamon and baked apples. My father was sitting in his armchair reading the paper, and my mother was knitting. They looked up, surprised but not hostile. Catherine didn't sit. She stood in the center of the rug, her hands trembling. I wanted to return this, she said, pulling the Christmas card from her bag. And I wanted to say, I was wrong. Not just about who you are, but about who I am. She took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. I spent my whole life thinking that if I had the biggest house and the best clothes, I would matter. When I saw you, I was scared. I was scared because you didn't need any of those things to be happy, and I have all of them and I'm miserable. I treated you like dirt because I was terrified you were better than me. And you are. My father set his paper down. He stood up slowly, not to intimidate, but to welcome. Catherine, he said gently, no one is better than anyone else. We are just walking different paths. I don't deserve your forgiveness, she sobbed, finally breaking down. I called you terrible things. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Catherine, my mother said, standing up. It's a gift. Like a pie. My mother walked to the kitchen and returned a moment later. In her hands was a plate with a slice of warm sweet potato pie, the very same dish Catherine had rejected at Thanksgiving. She held it out. Peace offering? My mother asked with a mischievous smile. Catherine looked at the pie, then at my mother's kind eyes. She took the plate. Her hands were shaking as she took a bite. She closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. It's delicious, she whispered. It tastes like home. We sat there for hours. We drank tea. We talked, not about estates or money, but about our childhoods, our fears, and our hopes. For the first time, Catherine wasn't the lady of the manor. She was just a lonely woman who had finally found a place where she didn't have to perform. As I watched my mother pour Catherine another cup of tea, I realized that the greatest power my parents had wasn't their billions. It was their grace. They had taken an enemy and turned her into family, not by fighting back, but by opening the door. Respect doesn't come from what you have in your pocket, but from what you have in your heart, and that is a currency that never loses its value.